Thanks a lot. It's kind of interesting to stand back there and listen to this about myself. I always like coming to Indiana. Part of my growing up years were spent in Cartersburg, which is just west of Indianapolis. And I always consider myself partially a Hoosier, although I know you aren't all Hoosiers. A lot of you are. And I know what it's like to come as a stranger to Hoosier land. Hi, Fred. And Schroeder, look at that. You see old friends. I mean, that's what happens. These two haven't talked to me for several years, and so it's just wonderful to see them here. I am excited about the work I'm doing. I think it's real important. Ilana and I were talking about writing at dinner, and I was a confirmed non-writer most of my life, absolutely terrified of writing. My freshman college professor helped me with that a great deal. He used to read my essays as examples of how not to write. And I never ever thought about being a writer. And when I was doing the work on women's reality, I'm a talker. I like to talk. I'm Irish. And my mother always said that Irish people always talk a lot, and we've kissed the Blarney Stone, and if we haven't, we should have. And we're quick of tongue and quick of wit and not real reliable. And that seemed okay for a long time. And so hearing someone list how many books I've written is a shock. It's just a shock. And a couple of years ago, I became a writer, even though I had several books out at that point. And I was doing some of my own deep work and also my own recovery work from my relationship addiction, doing 12-step work. And I finally realized how arrogant it was of me to continue to hold on to my belief that I wasn't a writer, that everything defied that definition, and that it was time that I accepted it. Since I've accepted it, I'm writing even more, and I'm loving it, absolutely loving it. So you probably will be seeing about a book a year from me for a while. I'm also a reader, and when I was thinking tonight about, I have the new book out, Escape from Intimacy, but M.A. tacked onto it Relationships in the 80s. And being here at AHP, I was kind of looking back. One of the nice things about getting old is that we have a history to look back on, and I've watched the evolution of some of the ideas that I see presented here, and I've been through some of the phases, and I have some perspective. And I love this paragraph. This is a book that I've just started reading. It's called Hot Flashes. Some of you might be interested in reading it. I thought this paragraph was especially meaningful. Let me just read it to you. I don't usually do this, but now that Leonard and I have been divorced for 3 years, my life is fairly disciplined. Indeed, I have largely banished wasteful emotionalism from my existence so that I function in a rational rather than a reactive mode. With considerable concentration, I have finally developed a control system for tuning out disturbing distractions and turning off disruptive relationships. Gradually, I've taught myself to experience solitude as freedom and aloneness as wholeness. Mine is a distinctly 1980s philosophy. Interesting, isn't it? Where we've come. And this is a book about, I think, a generation that is still struggling with who we are and who we've been in relationships. And I was being quizzed at the table a little bit tonight about why I had left AHP years ago. And my response was that it seemed beyond my threshold of flakiness at the time. And I thought I had a pretty high threshold of flakiness. And so I just had to pull away. And I pulled away from a lot of organizations. I don't know how many of you have read Jeffrey Mason's new book, Against Therapy. Have any of you seen it or read it? It's an interesting book. And it was an interesting experience for me reading it because he was talking about my teachers and my contemporaries and the insane things that we were doing. And I was so glad that most of them I hadn't done as I read that book. I remember back in, I think probably the 60s or 70s, there was luckily I can't remember his name, but there was a man in California who ran nude groups. And one of his techniques was what he fondly called asshole gazing. And this was supposed to help people get over their inhibitions. Remember that? Remember it? And these are some of the things that I think that we were trying to do back then to deal with some intimacy issues. And we're still dealing with intimacy issues. I believe that intimacy is one of the major issues that we face as individuals, as in relationship, as a society. I really believe that if we solve the intimacy issue, we can deal with an addictive society. I think an addictive society is terrified of our dealing with intimacy. Because if we are intimate with ourselves, and if we're intimate with each other, there is no possibility of continuing in these addictive patterns. Now, some of you may not be familiar with the work that I've been doing on addictions, but for me, it has been the missing piece in my own development as a person and as a professional. That my background in psychology, I loved it. I love psychology. After I finally got out, which seemed like years of, well, it wasn't torture. As I look back, it would be torture now. But at the time, I loved it. You know, I loved those rats. I loved those chickens. I loved all those things that I was doing. I can remember one day I was doing some Skinnerian research on chickens, and I was working between the zoology building and the psych building because I was working interdepartmentally, and I would spend a lot of time over in the zoology building operating on the brains of chicken embryos. Then I would hatch them, and I would carry them over to the psychology building where I put them in a Skinner box and taught them to peck at the lighted dot, for which they would get reinforcement. And I was trying to see if different brain lesions would result in different learning patterns in a Skinner box. Can you believe it? I mean, can you believe it? Now, the most exciting part of that research was when the chickens got loose one day. And the secretaries were trying to catch them. So it's nice to have a little perspective on our lives. You know what I mean? But what I did in graduate school, and I think this is part of my being a recovering psychotherapist, is when it got to a point where I was just about to get my degree, there was something in me that said, I can't do this. There's something wrong with this system. I don't know what it is. And at the time, I was very rational and logical, having survived graduate school all that time. I was very logical and rational. And I said, I am better known at this point than anyone in the department. I have more clinical experience than anyone in the department. I make more money than anyone in the department. Therefore, I don't have to get this degree. And I quit. And I quit for 20-some years. I only finished my doctorate 2 or 3 years ago. And I said, I have to make it on a competence model. There's something wrong with this model. I don't know what it is, but I have to make it on a competence model. Once I had done that, it was okay for me to go back and finish my degree. What I now know is that the training that I was getting was training me into the addictive system. And that the very work that I was expected to do was to, at a mega level, help perpetuate the addictive system. And I'm just grateful that some part of my intuition and my spirituality, which I think it was, which I then got a rational reason for, said stop. Stop and wait and see. I now know what that's about. With the work that I've been doing in addictions, and believe me, I was dragged kicking and screaming into this. I was what I a few years ago would call a raging codependent. I took care of everybody. I was available to my clients 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If there was an emergency, I would come through on it. Same way with my family, my friends, my neighbors, etc. And you know what happened? My heart stopped. Just stopped. Like that. I had an out-of-body experience. Was clinically dead. And I said at that point, if I come back, if I decide to go back, I have to be completely honest about everything I know and everything I see and call it the way I see it. And I have been. I decided to come back. It was very interesting where I went, by the way. I don't know how many of you read Jane Roberts stuff. Have you ever read The Education of Older Souls 7? I could not understand that book. I loved it, but I could not grok simultaneous lifetimes. I couldn't get it. I had finally dealt with reincarnation. I could get successive lifetimes, but I couldn't get living several lifetimes at the same time. And what happened was, I came into another existence when I went out here. I was aware that I was somewhere else. And it was a different time. And all I know is that I came in, it sort of, the image I have is kind of like a Brigadoon setting. Remember the opening scene of Brigadoon with the fair and the market? But it was in the Andes somewhere. And I was aware that I had not dropped in like Wonder Woman or Superman, but that I was already there, participating, and that my consciousness became aware of being there. And my thought, just before I decided to come back, was, I better look around and see who I know here. And then someone screamed at me, and what happened to me was I said, I better go back. I'm not finished yet. So, I'm here. And I wasn't finished. I feel like what I'm doing is very important. One of the things that I believe is absolutely essential is that we have to understand the role of addiction in our personal lives, in our families, in our organizations and our corporations, in our society, and on our planet. I really believe that much of our concern about ecology, pollution, world hunger, is related to addictive patterns in our societies and in our individuals. And what I've been saying lately to the people who train with me, this is serious. You can't play around with it. A lot of us would like to fool around with our addictions. We'd like to give up one or two, or maybe part-time, but we don't really want to do it. I think it's time where we have to do it. I was looking for one of the women you had up here, the tall one with the bangs. What's her name? Deb. She said, every time I listen to you, I get a kind of sick at my stomach. I said, thanks a lot. And she said, because you're not just asking me to change what I do as a therapist, you're asking me to change myself. And I said, that's right. That's what I'm offering. Not asking, offering, is the possibility of changing ourselves. Now, we live in a society that operates exactly like an active drunk. We do not just live in a society that supports addictions. We live in a society that demands addictions. We live in a society that is so sick itself that it requires us to shut off our knowing, our awareness, our intuition, our wisdom in order to be able to tolerate the society. Now think about, many of you, the places where you work. If you didn't numb yourselves, could you go to work on Monday? If you didn't shut off your awareness, would you be able to tolerate it? Now, we live in a society that knows nothing about intimacy because it has asked us to shut off our intimacy with ourselves. And unless we have intimacy with ourselves, there's no way that we can be intimate with anybody else. Absolutely no way. And we can't be intimate with ourselves when we operate out of an addictive process. Now, I believe that the normal process for this society is an addictive process, and that we all learn it in our families, in our churches, in our schools, and it seems normal to us. It's only when we start moving out of it that we see it. Remember in Women's Reality, those of you who read it, I compared what I then call the white male system, which I call the addictive system, I compared it to the pollution in Denver. Those of you who have ever been to Denver, it hangs over Denver kind of like a gray, yellow muck. When you're in it, unless it's really, really bad, you don't see it. You breathe it, you walk around in it, you eat in it, you don't see it. But you go up to the mountains and you look down and you say, I can't go in that anymore. I can't do it. But you don't see it when you're in it. Now that's the way this addictive system is. This addictive system is a system of illusion. It's built on the illusion of control, on the illusion of objectivity, on the illusion of perfectionism, on dishonesty, on confusion. Take the ones I've just mentioned and think about the way our federal government operates and see if it doesn't fit. You've been tuning in on the Oliver North trials lately? Dishonesty, confusion. So what we have is we have an illusionary system that tells us that it's reality, and it tells us that our reality is illusion. So that in order to fit into an illusionary system, We have to be willing to give up our awareness of our reality. And that's the purpose of addictions, is to shut off that awareness. Now, I have never met anyone with only one addiction. I think of the addictive process as like an underground river. And what happens is we usually face off with our addiction that is our favorite, that is killing us the fastest. And what happens is the river doesn't stop. It just takes a turn and takes another course. And then our next most favorite addiction that is killing us next fastest comes up. We have all learned addictive patterns. It is not just the drunks, the junkies, the sex perverts. It's all of us. We have learned addictive patterns, and we have been taught that those patterns are real and that they're normal for the human organism. I don't believe it. With the people with whom I work, I can tell when they walk in a room whether they're in their disease or not. In the 12-step program, we often hear, you have a disease. You are not your disease. It's real important. And we flip back and forth into our disease. Now let's talk about relationships in this context. I believe that the norm for relationships in this society is the addictive relationship. That we have very little or very few models for healthy relationships in this society. There are 3 major addictions that play a great role in addictive relationships: sexual addiction, romance addiction, and relationship addiction. These are very important ones. We haven't spent much time on them yet in the literature or in our awareness. Now, most of us, when we think about sexual addiction, we think about people who act out, rapists, incest perpetrators, voyeurs, exhibitionists, don't we? But that's not all to sexual addiction. Sexual addiction is being obsessed with sex and making it one of the most important aspects of anything you think or do. In this new book, I try to cover the other end of the continuum, because I think plenty of people are writing about sexual acting out and sexual crime and that sort of thing. That's easy, but what about the rest of us? What about the sexual anorexic? What about the person who is obsessed with sex and terrified of it? Who interprets everything sexually but won't be sexual? One of the examples I use in the book is a person who is a sexual anorexic, who so avoided any awareness of sex that she just didn't see that her teenage son was molesting her daughter. Sexual anorexia is prevalent, especially in the church. Very often the church is obsessed with sex, but in an anorexic way. And we don't learn healthy patterns of sexuality in our families or in our churches because of the obsession with sex. One of the fun things that I did in this book, which I really enjoyed doing as I was writing the book, is that I began to try to fantasize what it would be like if everybody in our culture recovered from sexual addiction. Can you imagine what advertising would do? What would the media do? What would we do with clothing? How would they sell ski boots? Cars? Think about it. And, most of all, how would the church spend its time? What if the church were forced to focus on spirituality for change? Don't you think it would be interesting? But with a sexual addiction, a sexually addictive society, we are constantly bombarded with an obsession with sex. Now, obsession and repression go together. I call it a Lincoln log. You can't have one without the other, and you can't get rid of one without the other. When we're obsessed with something, we repress it. And when we repress something, we become obsessed with it. They go together. We have to get rid of both of them to be different. What would happen if we as a nation begin to recover from sexual addiction? What would happen if we as individuals begin to recover from sexual addiction? One of the other sex addicts that I described in a book was a man who came to one of my intensives. Quiet, tall, handsome, gentle. He came into one of the sessions that I was doing, the first session, and he sat back against the wall. We were just checking in, saying who we were. It was a real short session. And he was twisting his hands, and his body was all pulled up, and he was biting his lip, and obviously real tense. And I thought, well, this man probably has trouble with groups or something. We'll see when we get to him. It was a men's intensive. It came his turn to check in. He said his name. And then he blurted out, "I'm a sex addict." Well, immediately the room went, and you could just see the fantasies going wild, He's pretty big. Am I safe in the bathroom? I don't know what to think about this guy. It was really interesting to watch the other men trying to stay cool. So being a group leader, it was clear to me I better get a little more information. I said, "Can you share a little more about your sex addiction, And he said, "My sexual addiction is that I'm a sexual fantasizer." And everybody went, "Oh, well." And he said, "I want you to take this seriously." He said, "I feel that I know that I'm an addict, and I know that this disease is progressive and fatal. Let me tell you about myself." He said, "I've been involved in sexual fantasy since I was a kid. High school didn't bait much. College, a little. Always knew I'd get married. But most of my relating was done on a fantasy level, and it was sexual. Married, has some kids. He thinks he has a good relationship with his wife. But he says, what is happening to me is my sexual fantasy is getting more and more intense, more and more violent, and it's requiring more and more time. And I find myself at work involved in sexual fantasy a lot, and I'm right on the verge of being fired. When I come home, I want to be alone so I can get into my fantasies. So I tell my kids and my wife I have a headache and I go up to bed. So that my relationship is falling apart. He said, "I'm afraid I'm going to lose my family." Recently I was driving on the thruway and I was involved in my sexual fantasizing and I had an accident and was almost killed. He said, "You can't tell me that my disease isn't fatal and isn't going to kill me sometime soon. I want help." And he said, "I'm saying this the first session because I'm willing to do anything to get past this." Addiction. He has an addiction that is progressive and fatal. We had another man who was a priest. He was a sexual addict. He was what I call a non-integrated celibate. He had an intellectual commitment to be celibate because he did not want to leave the priesthood. Had 2 affairs with women he really loved, but he didn't want to leave the priesthood. So he decided he had to be celibate. But much of his time and energy was spent fighting his own sexuality. And he was totally absorbed in that battle. His work was suffering, his relationship was suffering, his spirituality was suffering. He felt he had no options. He even felt that he couldn't go to a Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous 12-step meeting because it wasn't appropriate for priests. There's now one state that I know in the United States that has a central Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous group exclusively for priests. And they come from all over that state weekly for those meetings. That's sexual addiction. We have made sex so important that it is the way we define relationships. That it is the entree into relationships. That we're so afraid of it, we're so intrigued by it, we're so crazy around it, that it has become too important in the society. That's sexual addiction. And it's supported by the society. It's not just something we as individuals do. It's supported by the society. What it does is it sets up a situation where it's almost impossible to know how to have happy sexual relationships and healthy sexual relationships. Romance addiction. I call these, by the way, the pseudo-relationship addictions, because I think people use these addictions to try to form relationships, but what they're really doing is avoiding intimacy. Even though we think we're moving into relationships, when we come at it from an addictive way, it avoids intimacy and avoids relationships. It's not really relationships. Now, back in the 60s, that's what we were doing in places like this. We were going in and we were trying to find instant intimacy. Remember that? Remember those groups where you went and maybe you're doing it here, I don't know. But you gazed in each other's eyes, and you touched, got used to touching each other and hugging. Before that, people didn't do that much, Now it's kind of become the way we do things. But remember back then how so many people came to places like this to find sexual partners? Remember? I'm sure you aren't doing that now. But remember? AIDS has helped with that a lot. But we still think, I think, that one of the ways to form relationships is to look at someone and get a buzz. And that's a cosmic mate. Many of us look for the cosmic mate. Much of that is romance addiction. Now, what is romance addiction? Romance addicts are an interesting lot. They're addicted to the illusion, to excitement, to something different, to a relationship that's going to be unusual. Romance addicts are always looking for something that isn't there. And they spend a lot of time looking. Faraway places with strange sounding names. Romance addicts are looking for. There are a couple of other brand of romance addicts that are really important to mention. One is people who are addicted to a cause. Doesn't have to be a person or relationship, but who are addicted to a cause, and the romance of going after that cause and working for it and giving themselves to it. Some of you are smiling. Can be just as destructive as any other kind of addiction. Another kind of romance addiction is the addiction to suffering. How beautiful and pure it is to suffer. Some more of you are smiling. Think about it. Romance addicts frequently have been raised as little princesses and princes and are looking for other little princesses and princes to hook up with and want to be treated like a little princess or princess. Romance addicts have been raised in families that are expert on impression management. They are expert in presenting an image to the world, which may or may not be who they are. How many of you, for example, have grown up in perfect families, according to others, who didn't know what was going on inside your walls? And how much energy did your family put into looking good to the neighbors, for the church, for the community? And how many people have you thought were perfect families who later didn't seem to be quite so perfect? Think about it. Romance addiction. One romance addict that I worked with talked about always going to different places all over the world and pushing the adventure, looking for different kinds of sexual or excitement in relationships, but not being that interested in sex, just using sex to get the romantic hit. And what she described was whenever she went somewhere, the first thing she would do would be to try to imagine what would be the most romantic thing to do in that setting. For instance, I just happened to be in Hawaii when she was there, and she was talking. Immediately, she was looking into renting a helicopter because she decided the thing that would really be exciting would be to fly into an isolated waterfall and swim nude under the waterfall. Huh? You know that one? Me too. Yeah, right. But what she realized is when she does these things, she's never present. Because when she's doing them, her whole energy is tied up in how she's going to tell people about what she did. So she's always missing it. One woman shared with me that I was talking about this, and she said, "Oh my God, you're right." She said, "I can remember one time in Bangkok when I was fucking orange-clad Buddhist monk in a sampan, and I was thinking about how I was going to tell people about that." Romance addicts are never there. They're always on to the next thing. Always missing the present. Always missing the present. Now, romance addiction, like the other addictions, is progressive and fatal. And I give examples in the book of how this disease gets worse and worse and worse and worse. You need more thrill and more excitement to give you your fix. You precipitate more violence in your life in order to get the fix. Romance addicts frequently team up with sex addicts. They're not interested in sex, but they're interested in the excitement that comes from the sex addict. Romance addicts are always pushing the limit, but they're never there. Romance addicts don't stand or sit. They pose. Romance addicts are more concerned about how they look as a couple than who they are as a couple. And their main concern about forming a relationship is if that other person looks good beside them. Complete mask relationships. Relationship addicts, another ilk altogether. 3 main kinds of relationship addicts. 1 are people who are addicted to being in a relationship. Doesn't matter with whom, what, or what, as long as they've got one. That's the important thing. I think Hedda Nussbaum would fall into this category. Remember her in New York in the papers? Joel Steinberg and Hedda. He killed their adopted daughter. See, what we need to understand about addiction, and I think this is very important, is it's progressive and fatal. And in that process, we lose our ability to make judgments about our own life, what we're doing, and what's going on. We lose our ability to say, this is wrong. Think about this in everyday life when we're looking at ourselves as addicts. One of the things that I've had to do, for example, is I can't use aerosol anything anymore because my ability to make judgments is improving. Now I'm in recovery, and I know that every time I use aerosol, I'm destroying the ozone. I can't do it. But the denial system of the addictive system shuts off that awareness so that we aren't paying attention. Recently, the EPA has said, finally noticed and published, that 50% of the American public is breathing unhealthy, carcinogenic air. Have you noticed that recently in Indianapolis or where you live? Our addictive process shuts off that noticing so that we just move through life. We don't do it. We move through it. Now, the same with relationship addicts. Type 1 has to have a relationship. That's the fix. Can't be without a relationship. If it looks like a relationship is going to break up, they've got someone lined up already warming up in the bullpen. Do overlapping relationships a lot. Have to be a couple. Does this sound familiar to any of you? I don't know. Hello? None of you do that. Not at all. Amazing group here. Just an amazing group. Type 2. Let's try that. Type 2 are addicted to a relationship. They will hang on to a relationship even when they know it's killing them. Even when they know it's not good. And give themselves all kinds of reasons, like they're doing it for the kids. They can't support themselves. Whatever reason. But will hold on for dear death. You know, Norm Shealy, who was the founding president of the American Holistic Medical Association, said to me one time, he says, you know, people come to him for chronic, incurable pain. He said, you know, I can help about 80% of the people who come to me. Of that 80%, about 80% of that group are not really coming because of a physical problem, but the source of their problem is spiritual or psychological. Is that interesting? He told of one woman who came in the latter stages of incurable cancer for his program. She was there something like, I think their program was 12 days at that point. About day 10, she comes up and she says, Dr. Shealy, I don't have cancer anymore. I don't need to be here. And he said, really? And she said, yeah. I know I don't have cancer anymore. I'm cured. And he said, well, you know, you were supposed to be in the final stage. She said, no, I'm not. He said, okay, I believe you. She went home, said to her family, I'm so much better. I really, you know, I got myself, I don't have cancer. They said, yes, you do. She said, no, I don't. Yes, you do. Now, you can't deny it. You have it. You're going to die. No, I'm not. She went to the hospital, got checked out, no sign of cancer. 2 weeks later, her husband committed suicide. Someone had to go in that relationship. If she wasn't willing to, he did. Addictive relationships are deadly. They're deadly to our soul and our being and our ability to contribute to our society. It's important to remember that. Hanging on to a sick relationship can kill you. And yet, again, where do we learn to do that? At home, our schools, our churches, societies, supports that. Third type of relationship addiction is a person who practices his or her relationship addiction on everybody they see. Doesn't matter. They can be in an addictive relationship with a fence post. The person at the checkout stand at the supermarket is not just a person checking you out, but is a person to get approval from, to get to like you, to get to notice who you are, etc., etc., etc. Practicing that same kind of needy relationship addiction on anybody you meet. Your kids, your friends, your parents, your boss. Trying to set something up. Addictive relationships. These three go together to form addictive relationships. And one of the things I said is every book I sort of get one line I really like. The line I like in this new book is, sex addicts come on, romance addicts move on, and relationship addicts hang on. They braid together to form addictive relationships. Now, what do we know about healthy relationships in this society? Not a lot, I don't think. But let me tell you some things that I think that we can look at. First of all, in order to be in a healthy relationship, you have to be intimate with yourself. You have to have a relationship with yourself. If you don't know who you are, and you don't need that relationship, you probably can't have a healthy relationship. If you need that relationship, you are probably trying to use it to find your identity, your selfhood, your awareness, etc. It's only when you don't need it that you can have it. Paradoxical, isn't it? If you are not intimate with yourself, you don't bring anybody to it. And so what happens is you're trying to relate to each other to find out who you are. It's what Virginia Satir used to call the wet noodle syndrome. Like two wet noodles trying to lean on each other and hold each other up. Doesn't work. In healthy relationships, I think there are at least 5 simultaneous relationships going on at the same time. There's my relationship with me. There's your relationship with you. Those are 2. Then, and these are fun, there's my fantasied relationship with you. And your fantasied relationship with me. But unlike addictive relationships, where the fantasy relationships are just between our masks, and we believe the fantasies, in a healthy relationship, I know my fantasy about you is a fantasy, but I play with it anyway. And we share it sometimes, and even though you may be short, fat, stubby, and bald, I see you as tall, handsome, hairy. And that's okay. Because I know we play with it. Then there's our real relationship with each other. And it has a life of its own. Number 5. It's not imaginary. It's real. And it's not static. It's a process. Now, what helps to develop this? I think one of the most important things is honesty. That it's not possible to have healthy relationships unless we're honest with ourselves and we're honest with each other. Now, most of us have been trained that if we're honest in relationships, we won't be able to hold on to our man or our woman. Remember those things we used to read as kids on how to form relationships? Remember those magazines? One of the ways to form relationships is to be able to listen to someone intently even when you have no interest whatsoever in what they're saying? Remember that? Or remember that one of the skills of forming relationships is to be able to spot a cosmic mate across a crowded room? Remember? Romance addiction? Or remember that we were taught that to have relationships, we had to be willing to suffer and sacrifice? Remember that? That we had to be willing to lay aside our own value system and our own morality for the sake of the relationship? Remember that? All this training that we've had is to form addictive relationships. We've had very little training to form healthy relationships. We know very little about intimacy in this society. Much of what we have been taught is an approach to intimacy, is an avoidance of intimacy. Our own intimacy with ourselves and our intimacy with each other. I am so serious tonight. Usually I'm so funny. I don't know what this is about. Well, I guess maybe it's because I'm going to Russia. I think I have to be serious about these things, huh? Huh? That is serious. It is serious. And I am really aware that this is serious stuff. You know, that this is serious stuff. We think that relationship addiction and romance addiction and sexual addiction is not as serious as alcoholism and drugs, but it is. It really is. And what I find is under every recovering alcoholic, drug addict, is relationship addiction and romance addiction. It's there. That we need to look at this and we need to understand it. I think that it's so important for us to begin to see that we don't know anything about intimacy. You know, people are writing about it and say they're how-to books. Have you read any of these how-to books on how to form intimacy? It's like our list on how to form addictive relationships. I mean, and yet, you know, they sell. Somebody said recently they'd read an article in, I can't think of I'm not good on quoting anyway, but anyway, I can remember the quote. They said, I read an article in one of the, like Omni or one of these magazines, and what they said was all these self-help books out, but you got to have a self in order to do self-help. You know? I thought it was a great line. I wish it had been mine. And this is what I think is missing. You know, we can't do this without a self. And addiction erodes the self. It's very subtle in our society, but it's very, very deadly. Now, what are the characteristics of addiction? Let's just kind of list those for our thinking so that we remember them. Dishonesty. Dishonesty is a big one. Not being able to be honest with ourselves or others. And I'm not talking about great big dishonesties. I'm talking about little bitty ones that show up in a relationship. Like, do you want to do this? Sure. But you don't. That's dishonesty. How are you feeling? Oh, fine. But you're not. That's dishonesty. Do you want to have sex? Yeah. But you don't. That's dishonesty. Now, relationship addicts will use romance and sex to get their fix. They're not interested in either one, but they'll use it. Relationship addicts will hang on with a sex addict till they get battered to death. But they aren't interested in sex. Romance addicts will hang on to these other two. They feed off of each other. Feed off of each other. Dishonesty. Self-centeredness is another characteristic of addiction. Self-centeredness to me is one of my very favorites. Self-centeredness means not only thinking only of yourself, but it also means placing yourself in the center of the universe and defining everybody else in terms of you. So that anything that anybody does, it's because for or against me. Like, for example, this fellow trying to keep awake over here. It's because of me. It's not because he's tired. It's because of me, right? No, it's because he's tired. But if I'm in my self-centeredness, I'm sure that it's for or against me. Self-centered people have no boundaries. They don't know where others end and they begin. As a matter of fact, they don't even know that others end and they begin. If you're self-centered, you have to try to control other people because all of them are a danger to you. Now think about how we operate that way as a country. Anything that happens on the planet is either for or against us, isn't it? And we have to get our nose in it right away. There is no way that we can see that other people have boundaries and rights because we operate self-centeredly as a nation. What comes out of that is the illusion of control, which is another characteristic of addiction. Addicts try to control everything. We have grown so accustomed to the illusion of control that we don't even think it's abnormal. We believe that we should be able to control what we feel, what we think, what we do, our lives, and a lot of what we say is, when things aren't going well, my life is out of control. I got to get things under control, under control, under control. Any system that is built on the illusion of control is an addictive system. Whether it's an individual system, a family system, an organization, or a society. Whenever we are trying to control ourselves, others, the universe, other nations, it's addiction. It's addicts. It's an addictive way of functioning. That's why part of recovery requires the growing awareness that we can participate in our lives, we can't control our lives. That there is a power greater than ourselves who is also participating with us. And unless we remember that, we cannot be whole. Now, I believe that we are coming to a time, I was listening to Professor whatever his name was tonight, I didn't get that. Oops. I was just saying my favorite line in Rain Man was, uh-oh, uh-oh, uh-oh. I just thought he delivered that fantastically. And I feel a lot of uh-oh these days as I travel around the world. I think that one of the most exciting things that we have going on in the world right now is we are reaching, I think, a critical mass of people who are actively recovering from their addictions. As I travel around the world, I am so impressed with the number of 12-step groups, the excitement about 12-step groups. I do a lot of training in Germany. 3 years ago, there were hardly any 12-step groups. Now there are bunches of 12-step groups. And every person who's training with me in Germany has been able to find a 12-step group to go to. People are beginning to see that this addictive process is killing us. Now, another thing that I think is exciting is the whole, and this is where Professor Oops comes in, is the whole holographic view of the universe. The holographic science that's developing. To me, that's one of the most exciting things because the science that we have had, I believe, the scientific method that most of us are raised on, is one of the major cornerstones for the addictive system. It's a science that's based on control, the illusion of objectivity. How are we doing, Fred? etc. And that very belief in that science has resulted in a system that is now disintegrating. I believe that as we understand the hologram and the holographic science, that paradoxically each of you is an individual and you are also the entire hologram in each of you. Well, I get goose pimples every time I say that. That you do not operate alone. That everything you do affects everything else in the universe. When I said that AHP was adolescent a few years ago, it was probably true. But we have been adolescent too. Because one of the things that we have been unwilling to see is that we are responsible for what we do. Not to blame, not accountable, but responsible. That we need to own what we do. Because everything we do is part of everything else. I can't do anything unless it affects you and you and you in some way. And I haven't wanted to see that. I haven't wanted to see that the universe functions in a holographic way. And it's more than the sum of its parts. That I am the same. Now, for me, that translates in living my own process. That each of us is a process. We're not a thing. We're a process. And that process, when we are living it, is one with the process of the universe. And our addictions put us out of touch with that process. But when I am living my process is God. And God is more than my process. When I am out of touch with my process, I am out of touch with the hologram, and I lose my place in the universe. I think of the universe as a big puzzle. And each of us is a piece of that puzzle. In order to take our place as a piece of that puzzle, I have to live who I am, not a mask, not somebody else's illusion of who I am, not my illusion of who I am, but who I am. I have to do what I'm here to do, whatever that means for each of us. And it's something different for each of us. When I don't live my process, there's a hole in the universe. Right now, in terms of where we are in history, I believe that we have a universe with a lot of holes in it. Because a lot of us are trying to live someone else's image of who we are, or someone else's plan or script for who we are. And unless each of us lives our own process, we cannot take our place in the hologram. In order to take our place in the hologram, we have to know who we are. Now, in sobriety, in the 12-step program, the concept of sobriety, I know that my sobriety, my spirituality, and my process are the same thing. When I am not sober from my addictions, I cannot know what my process is. My addictions cloud my awareness of my own process. When I am sober, I live my sobriety, I live my process, and I take my place in the universe. I invite you to take a look at your addictions. The first step toward clarity is admitting the ways in which we function addictively. My name is Anne. I'm a relationship addict. Hi. Okay. Questions? Do we have time for questions? Comments? You've been very patient. I haven't been as entertaining tonight as I usually am, but you have a lot of other entertaining people here, so. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a good question. Thank you.